talk about engaging autism, some developmental implications for early intervention. And what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about why engagement should be a target for early intervention. And then talk a little bit about some studies we've done on trying to change engagement. So these are either therapist-led interventions or they're parent-mediated interventions. And then I want to talk a little bit about what's new, what's next, and particularly around underserved and underrepresented populations, which I've spent a lot more time in the last 2 or 3 years thinking about. Okay, so engagement should be a critical intervention target. And I don't think I have to talk about what autism is. I think most of you probably know that. I am at the Mind Institute. So what we think about when we think of engagement is that this is really a very early sign with infants. And it stays pretty consistent across age, even though it changes with development. So some of the behavioral signs that we look for are shared attention and affect, joint attention, which I'll talk more about, social play with others, and then, of course, later, conversation. You know, that sort of give and take that kids have, and that some of our kids have a lot of difficulty with. So I'm going to show you a couple of little clips of what non-engagement and engagement look like. So this will probably seem familiar to many of you who do the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. But this first little guy is a 17-month-old that came in, and he's getting an ADOS T.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's what we would consider being very object-focused, and Mom says that he makes everything fly. He loves any kind of object like this. But there were other moments during this assessment in which the therapist was tickling him, and he looked completely like a regular 17-month-old. So there are these moments where it's difficult to engage him, especially around this particular object. And being object-focused is something that we target in interventions. So I'll show you what we're going for. This is a typical 18-month-old, and this is on the early social communication scales. Peter Mundy, who's here at Davis, this is his scale.
Charlie, Charlie! It's a cow.
Monkey.
It's a monkey.
Play.
Oh, and the parrot?
Pig.
Parrot. Whoa! Charlie, Charlie! It's a crab.
Okay, so just 1 month difference, and you see just the huge difference in affect and attention and engagement and communication. So besides the obvious delays in development of the little boy who's 17-month-old, there are other issues around just that engagement piece. And it's a pretty tough piece to try to intervene on, but it's exactly what we try to change. We know that intervention can improve engagement. And there have been different target interventions that focus on these behaviors, specific behaviors that are associated with engagement, things like joint attention. So joint attention gets thrown around as a term a lot of times. And I'm going to define it in Peter Mundy words because I learned from him. So joint attention is really shared attention and affect vis-a-vis objects or events. So it's basically sharing that experience or that object with another person. And it's what our kids have a lot of difficulty doing. Requesting skills also require some joint attention, but the requesting function for communication is different from a joint attention function. So it's the function of the behavior that's so important and so different for kids with autism. So joint attention gestures might be a point to an airplane, as if, and the child might point to the airplane, look back at mommy, back at the airplane, back at mommy, as if to say, wow, do you see what I see? Okay, you're sharing that event, you're sharing attention. When the child wants something like the toy or the cookie in the cupboard, they might point to the cupboard, look back at mommy, point to the cupboard in the same way, but the function is different. They want the cookies. They're not sharing attention. They're going, eh. They're probably fussing, right? Especially if you don't understand what it is that they want. So the two different points have a different function, and it's the joint attention sharing function that's more difficult for our kids. So that's an important target for early intervention. Then other parts of this engagement piece are play skills. So the little boy that you saw, the 17-month-old, was holding an object, was very interested in the object, but he wasn't really doing much play-wise with it. So the play skill, play level was delayed. All right, so developmentally that was delayed. And so we really work very hard on social play routines as a means for engaging kids. Social imitation, kids imitate. You saw the 18-month-old imitating the adult. And a shared activity is important. So you have to find something that's of interest that you can share. All right, so there have been several studies now on joint attention. And it's not so easy to change. Most of the studies have been single subject designs, and there have been a series now in the last 10 years. It's been amazing how this area has really, really increased. And I think single subject designs, meaning like about 2 to 3 subjects, are very carefully followed and tested, and then the skill is intervened on very strategically so that you can measure change. Those are really important kinds of studies to do, in that you can really get your measurement down and you can see if the treatment is having any effect at all. But most of the single subject designs that have been done have really focused more on responding rather than initiating. Our kids do better on responding to something. As you can imagine, we tell them to do something, they learn to do it. But they don't initiate, they don't spontaneously initiate as often. While initiating is more impaired, it's also more difficult to change. The studies have also just focused on a single skill, like following a point. Well, joint attention actually has several skills and qualities, not just one. So it's showing, it's pointing, it's looking between objects and people. And because you're sharing an experience or event, positive affect is more common. So that's a qualitative aspect of joint attention that really helps to differentiate the function between joint attention and requesting. And the other issue with most of the single subject designs is that they don't, not all of the participants will maintain the skill, and they don't always generalize it across settings and contexts and people. So I think that if the child doesn't maintain the skill, then probably it wasn't developmentally targeted correctly. So this is a developmental skill that children, once they learn, should not lose, unless they're having some sort of regression. But if they're in a developmental trajectory, developing their skills, they shouldn't actually lose that skill if it was taught and targeted properly. Okay, there have also been some group designs. So comprehensive programs address these core deficits. But the outcomes, because they're so comprehensive and sometimes they're so involved and so long-term, that we don't actually measure the outcome in terms of these core deficits, but we tend to look more at just general developmental outcomes. Or if they have very specifically addressed these different areas, they either have the specific outcome is unmeasured, or they don't find a difference. All right, so right now there's not tons of evidence that changing joint attention has any effect on anything else, but I'm going to tell you about a couple, okay? Because I still think it is the way to go. It is, you can get change. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about some studies that we did a number of years ago now. Originally we did a study where all of the children in an early intervention program were getting 30 hours of ABA. So these were 3 and 4-year-old kids getting 30 hours, the same ABA program. So a little unheard of, but they were only there for a short period of time, right? So it's a hospital day treatment program. So we did a randomized control trial of about 58 3 and 4-year-old kids. When the kids would come into the program, we would randomize them to either a joint attention intervention, symbolic play intervention, or we just let them have the 30 hours of ABA. So all of them had this background of pretty intense behavioral treatment. But one of the things that the ABA program back in 1998 when we started this, they didn't have a focus on joint attention or symbolic play, right? That was quite a while ago. So we were pretty sure that what we were targeting was new content for kids. So this was a therapist-led intervention. It was only for 5 to 6 weeks, but it was every day for about 30 minutes. And the approach, so I, starting out, had no curriculum to follow, and I believe that probably all the approaches that exist work. That's why they exist. So we did a little bit of everything. We did about 5 minutes or so of priming at the table, kind of a discrete trial approach with the target that we were working on, and then we went to the floor and we did more sort of a combined developmental and behavioral approach. And we had a very specific manual and very specific strategies. But you can see that we kind of believed in both approaches. And what we found was that the children that, so here you have time 1, 2, 3, and 4. So time 1 to time 2 is about 5 to 6 weeks, about 30 sessions. Time 3 is 6 months later. Time 4 is 12 months later. And so when we looked at changing joint attention, we got some changes in some skills. But interestingly, we got this generalization to the mom who was not involved in the treatment in terms of joint engagement. So children initiated more joint engagement with their moms at the end of treatment and then each time during the follow-up. So you can see that we got an effect, but interestingly, we got an effect of both the play treatment and the joint attention treatment. So neither of those were different from each other, but the control group that was getting 30 hours of ABA didn't really change much. So then when we taught play, so some of the kids got a play intervention, and what we found there was that play level changed for kids who got the play. So the main point of this is that you kind of get what you teach. So if you add in the content using a variety of approaches, we got big effects on those particular skills. Okay, so what, right? They looked better in terms of their joint attention, but does that mean anything for later development? So what we did was we looked at their language skills 1 year later, and we found that both treatment groups had better language skills a year later. So that translates to about 15 to 17 months language age compared to about 7 months for the control group. All right, so that change in joint attention really seemed to increase their ability in language. So I was also interested in the kids who were lower in language to begin with. So when we look at those kids, and there were about 10 kids in each group that were really pretty impaired in terms of their language, had fewer than 5 words to begin with as 3-year-olds. And the kids that were randomized to the joint attention intervention actually did better a year later in language. So we had an aptitude by treatment interaction or a moderator effect, where the kids in the joint attention intervention actually made 13 months language gain in 12 months versus kids in the control group who made about 3 months. All right, so nice effect. So it tells me that sort of this is all tied developmentally, that joint attention really matters for kids, and it probably matters the most for kids who don't have a lot of language to begin with. All right, so there's a real payoff from this early focus on joint attention and joint engagement. We have just analyzed the 5-year follow-up data of that sample of children from the original study. We only got 40 out of 58 children back, which, is good or maybe not so good. And I can tell you stories about why people didn't come back. So some were lost because of, they moved or we couldn't find them. Some of them wouldn't come back because their children were so high functioning that they didn't want to be associated in any way with a treatment program. It's kind of sad for us, but great for them. And then some families, children didn't progress very much, and they were just tired. They're tired of the testing. And so we kind of had both ends, extreme ends of the spectrum probably lopped off. So this is kind of our middle group. 32 of those children became verbal, and 8 were minimally verbal at an average of about 9 years of age. So we wanted to find out, well, what's predicting expressive language, spoken language at age 9? So we put into our model our treatment groups, chronological age. Did it matter if you were on the younger end of the spectrum of 3 to 4 or at the older end? IJA, which is initiates joint attention, because in our treatment program, it was all about initiating joint attention. Those were the only behaviors we really counted. Play level. Expressive language, so where you begin with language, does that matter? Your developmental quotient, these were little kids, your IQ, DQ, and gender. And these are the variables that matter. So for us, what's really interesting is that treatment group is still there, controlling for everything else. So it helps to be younger, yes. It helps to have better language to begin with, but the treatment group, being in either the play or the joint attention group, made a difference in terms of later outcome. And it's like 12 points different standard score that many years later. All right, so a logical extension for us was to now think about working with younger children. So I started this in like 2003, and at that time there weren't a lot of programs for toddlers. So I thought, great, we're going to give them something before they get into early intervention. Well, Southern California, and you learn that people have access to a lot of services. So even these kids were getting some services, which is not true around other places in the country. But our goal was to really figure out if we could help parents engage their kids in ways to facilitate progress in these core developmental areas. So now, instead of using the therapist, little kids are with their parents. What can we do to help parents do better in terms of engaging their kids? So we focused on joint attention, play, engagement. And we were really interested in what those active ingredients of a good parent-mediated model would be. So that concerns dose. How much do we need to see them to get an effect? Content. What is the content? So again, joint attention, engagement, play. What's the approach? And so I'm a firm believer in combining approaches. So we use behavioral and developmental strategies. So in this study, we had 38 dyads. We saw them 8 weeks, 3 times a week for 24 sessions. And we did a one-on-one parent modeling approach with the child. We now had a name for our treatment called Jasper. Don't ask. Joint attention, symbolic play, engagement, and regulation. We couldn't call it the UCLA program. There are too many intervention programs called the UCLA Early Intervention Program. So I'm going to show you a little guy that, so the main thing is that you target kids' skills developmentally. So we always have joint attention targets, but what might change is requesting for really young kids, because that's just an easier skill. It's an easier skill to change. It's an easier skill for them to actually do. So this is a little guy who came in at 22 months, chronological age, and about 8 months language age. So when they first come in, you're going to see an amazing mom. She's very synchronized to her kid, very responsive.
And how's what you say? I see a man! He said, Daddy! Rawr! 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 2 dinosaurs! One, 2. Let's see what ooh, funny ball. he did it all. He's bald-headed.
So, I mean, she's doing great things. She's really great. I think where we can come in and help tweak the interaction is we want to help her figure out how to progress his play, progress his communication. And so seeing them twice a week, 8 weeks, 24 sessions. What we have now at Exit is a mom who's showing many of the strategies that she would have learned in this intervention program. So she's facilitating the environment, she's down at his level, she's making sure that she takes her turn, she's waiting. We've got a child who's now showing you some requesting points.
His hat! You did it! Good job! You want help? Okay, I will help put it back on. Stand up, man. Man. Ready, set, go!
Okay, that was 6 months later. So at the exit, which you're probably not going to see, you just see really nice interaction that's very synchronized, but really pulling for communication. What you see 6 months later is a child who's now, using symbols, right? He's more verbal. So this is a mom who's worked really hard throughout this entire time and really gotten some nice effects with her kid. Okay. So what we found in that study was that we could decrease object engagement. So if you think about that first little guy that we saw that was so focused on objects, what we want to do is to get him unfocused on just objects, but to actually become more communicative, not so focused on just a single object. And what we want to do is increase joint engagement. And this is very much supported by the parent. The parent is there, but the child is aware of another person and objects. So that's very important, and they can start to use skills within that. But getting these two changes in engagement is really important. We also, in that study, found that children increase responding to joint attention on the ESCS, which was a separate assessment. They increased the diversity of functional play because they're young, so they weren't actually at the level of symbolic play. Some kids were, but as a group, this functional play became more diverse. And that maintenance increased, they maintained their skills over time, and growth continued because developmentally they didn't lose skills, they continued to grow over a year. There's other considerations to think about with parents, and I'm sure that most of you who are clinicians in the audience think about this, and that is buy-in. How much do you believe in this treatment? How much does this fit within your family? And if it works and it fits and you buy in, you're more likely to do the actual strategies and may have bigger benefit from it. And we found that to be the case in this particular study. So all of the parents, this is the caregiver diary we would have parents fill out once a week. All the parents said great things. Oh, I love this, we're all high, right? Probably because we were right there. But we also had the interventionist rate the caregiver every week. Things like how comfortable are they? How confident are they? How happy are they? And there was a difference. And so the parents that were much more confident with their strategies, it's not just about fidelity, but really bought into the intervention, actually had greater effects on their kids, even though the kids were not different to begin with. So buy-in matters. So for some parents, maybe they need a different kind of model to really affect change in their kids. Okay, so we've also done other toddler interventions. This is one of the many studies that you mentioned earlier. We've just finished a comparative randomized controlled trial. So the first study, the toddler study I told you about, was a waitlist control. That seemed reasonable to me. You want to make sure that everybody gets treatment, but we needed to have some comparison. So we say, okay, you're just going to have to wait for 8 weeks. Well, 8 weeks in the life of a toddler is a long time, right? You're desperate to get into treatment. You don't want to wait. So we've moved away from waitlist controlled designs and now are doing comparative randomized trials. So we really are trying to isolate what the active ingredient of a treatment is. So in the study we've just completed, we did JASPER, which is parent-mediated. This time it's the kids are all in the same intervention program, so they're getting a heavy dose of treatment. We're seeing them twice a week for 10 weeks, so 20 sessions. Or they get a parent education model, and we're using a model that's also evidence-based. It's Brotherton and Tong's parent education model that reduces stress for families of young kids. And we did 3 and 6 month follow-up assessments. We saw 80 toddlers and parents over the last 4 years. So you can see that they're, toddlers. They're about 30 months. They have, fairly high developmental quotients. These seem to be the developmental quotients that everyone's getting in this age range when you look at a group of kids. It's a mostly majority type sample, but we've got some diversity in our sample. All right, so what we find here is that parents can change their behaviors. So parents are better able to engage their kids in social routines, and this is the difference between entry and exit over 10 weeks. The blue line is our parents that are getting the hands-on parent-mediated model versus parents who are getting the same dose but caregiver education. So it matters how we approach teaching families. You can look at how parents are just doing so much modeling of joint attention when we teach them with the hands-on model. And they don't do that necessarily if they're just getting a parent education model. For the kids, we see a big change in joint engagement. So their engagement level is going up as significantly higher than caregivers or kids in the education model, and play level is improving. And we have differences, lots of other little differences on individual skills, on the ESCS, and so on. What we don't have yet is the 3 and 6 month follow-up because we're still following them up. But the key question is, does this matter? What happens to developmental outcomes? Do any of these particular skills affect language development? And that's, of course, what we would hope for. So now I just want to switch a little bit and talk about the difference between preverbal and nonverbal children. So a lot of us are really interested in language development. And so, we talk a lot about nonverbal children and children who aren't learning language fast enough and what we can do to help them increase their language learning. But a child who's 2, in my mind, is preverbal. They're going to talk. I'm assuming they're going to talk. They're just developmentally delayed. A 3-year-old could be preverbal. A 4-year-old could be preverbal. But once you get up closer to 5, people start talking about kids being nonverbal. And the worrisome part is that the best social and adaptive outcomes so far have been found for children who are verbal by school age. So we have a lot of parents who come to us very panicked over the fact that their child's not really that verbal and they should be starting kindergarten. All right, so while the majority of kids are going to become verbal, there's a significant portion that aren't. So we've been doing a study of what we're calling minimally verbal kids, because I don't actually think nonverbal is the right term. Most of our kids who are nonverbal have some sounds or words that they may or may not use functionally. They may have scripted phrases that they may or may not use functionally, but most kids have some words. And some people would actually say that a child who has even one word is better off than a child who has no words. We don't actually know that to be a fact yet because we haven't had enough studies, but it's an interesting hypothesis. So we are doing a study of these older kids. They're 5 to 8 years of age, and they have to have fewer than 20 words used functionally. And so even if you have a child who uses this many words, sometimes they just don't use them very often. But we can count up sometimes through a lot of different measures, assessment measures, about 20 words. And we wanted the kids in this particular study to have a developmental age of over 24 months because part of our design was to give them an augmentative device where the reviewers actually felt that they needed to be at least 2 developmentally. And this is a multi-site study with Ann Kaiser at Vanderbilt. So we've incorporated now Jasper and her EMT, Enhanced Milieu training for teaching children language skills together. And and then we give them either an augmentative device or not in our randomization. And so Rebecca Landa and Pam Mathy at Kennedy Krieger are also participants. We have a crazy design. This is a SMART design. This is a sequential, multiple, alternating, randomized treatment model. Something like that. SMART design. It's very smart. The goal here is that, so you have children who haven't made as much progress as you wanted them to make. They've made progress in early intervention for sure, but they haven't made enough progress in language. So we don't want to randomize them to nothing or to a wait list or to like a sham intervention. We want to give them something that we think could work. So you want to randomize them to 2 different treatments, both of which should be effective. So in this case, we're randomizing kids to either the joint attention EMT treatment, focusing on spoken language, or joint attention EMT with the augmentative device. So in this case, we thought the augmentative device might be really important. Now, after 3 months of treatment, which is twice a week for an hour each session, we measure the responder status. So all of those measures have to do with how we measure responder status, and it's not just one measure. So we're trying to think about what level of improvement do we need to see in about 3 months to say, continue on with this treatment. And if they're a non-responder, then let's give them something else. We're going to either increase the dose of the treatment, so 3 times a week, or we're going to give them the alternative treatment. So if they came in without the augmentative device, they could get the augmentative device. And then we're going to test whether or not that has any additive effect. So it's a pretty complicated design, and we're still in the midst of it. But I want to talk about some of the treatment issues that we've come across and some of the kids that, I'll show you some examples of kids. So this is a little guy. I'm going to show you clips. He was 5.5 when he came in. He was, I think, about between 2 and 3 on a lighter, like a nonverbal IQ test. But he came in with no words that he used functionally and no sounds. He's a very quiet child, but he clicked for yes and no, which tells you he had some communicative intention. And he also had fairly decent play skills. So what you're going to see is session 1, where he's the first session with the therapist. So already in the first session, they start to make some gains. But he's engaged, but he's not really talking. Then you'll see him at session 24, where we decide responder status, and then you'll see him when he exited at 48 sessions. So it's a 6-month treatment.
Want boat or blocks? Boat on.
Boat.
Green. Sorry.
Colors.
No green.
Colors. Blue.
Oh, you want a blue,
Blue.
back.
Boats. Drive.
Drive
boat.
boats. Blue. Girl.
Girl. Boy.
Boy. Turn.
Turn. Shovel.
Oh, shovel dirt.
Shovel.
Swing.
Thermometer. Hit.
Hit thermometer.
So he's a pretty smart little guy. You know, jumped 2 years on the PPBT in 6 months. So, you know, what I would say about this is that giving him access to communication is huge for this kid. He was programming this device within the 8th session. So he never had one before. When we count just unique words over session, we start off at about, I think, 1 in session 1, and 24, you can see it goes up to about 60 cumulative unique words that we counted within these sessions. But he's approximated over the course of treatment about 300 words. So he's approximating the sounds. So this is a little guy that needs probably pretty intensive. He could be a talker, right? He could be verbal if he continues to get good treatment. So anyway, it's interesting. Here's another little guy who's 7 years old. So one of the things you'll notice in the treatment is that we talk less, so he talks more. So it may seem like we're being really quiet, but it's all very strategic. So we're following Ann Kaiser's sort of model of how we program or talk about the language. And you can see he's got his own ideas, and he's coming up with them, and he's putting 2 words together at times, or phrases together. This little guy is 7 years old, came in with lots and lots of challenging behaviors, needed a break every 30 seconds for probably the first month. And that's what he was used to getting. So for us, that's really good because that's a kid who's communicating. He's telling us he wants breaks, and he's giving us a lot of behavior, which means that he wants to communicate. And 7 to 8 years, I think, is the limit of this kind of toy play, but you'll see.
E.
Sit down.
You want to ban him so he can sit?
Stand.
Slide. Slide.
Off.
Slide.
Slide down.
Let's slide.
Let's slide down. Let's slide down roller coaster.
Okay, so he's making changes too. So his cumulative unique words also went up, but you know, they're putting words together. So again, he's another kid who needs to go into pretty intensive intervention that's been different from what he's had before, but making nice gains. And the best thing about him is he can stay engaged for almost the whole session. We don't have any more breaks. That left after a couple of months. So, you know, it really is a different approach to teaching them language, and it seems to be working, but they just need more of it. Okay, so that study is still ongoing, and it's important to really think about who is responding to this treatment. So about 75% of the kids so far have responded according to the criteria that we set out beforehand. So I think we would probably revise that now and think about that, because you want, in this model, about 50% responding. So we probably set the bar too low So the kids are actually doing really well. One thing we know is that we can get them engaged. So they may have the first few sessions of not being engaged. So if we measured the amount of time of an hour that they were engaged, it might be a couple of minutes in the first session. But by the time they leave in 6 months, we can engage them for, an hour. And they're engaging us. So it goes back and forth. The critical issue is, can that generalize? And if we only do it in a therapy setting, it's not going to generalize, probably. And how do we get ourselves now inserted into school settings and community settings and homes where we can make this different? So one of the issues about the kids that we're seeing is that a lot of families don't want us to come to the home. Things aren't easy at home. So that's one issue. But I think we need to push in and try to help in ways that we can. And the other one is it's difficult to get into schools and to make a difference there. And so, we're trying to do that. And we have lots of school studies, but not for this one yet. But that would be the next goal, because I don't think any of us have a really good handle on what to do for kids that are minimally verbal. But as you can see, they can make progress, and these kids are smart. They're really about half of our kids are reading. So we also have another wonderful little guy who's 7, who I'm not sure how we figured it out, but he seemed like he was reading. And I asked the mom, and she just would whisper, "I don't think so. I don't know. I read to him every night." Well, yeah, he's reading. So when we assessed his reading, he's clearly reading. He's nonverbal, but he knows when you skip a word, and he makes you go back, and he loves books. So here's a little guy who we ought to think about literacy into language. And we have to, I think, be more creative in our research, in our clinical approach to this particular group of kids. Okay. So underserved, so clearly these kids are underserved. But there are also other groups of kids that are underserved. So kids who have limited access to early intervention, so are under-resourced areas where they just don't have access to services. Even if you wanted to get services, you couldn't. And I think Lori Vismar is really addressing this issue in such nice ways, because we need people that can go in with telemedicine or other kinds of approaches and get services to families who need them. Also, low-income, under-resourced families are really underserved. So we need to have good ways about going to them and providing services and thinking about some of the cultural barriers that are maybe in place. So we have done a recent study with that, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. We've also seen high-functioning kids who are fully included in general ed classrooms, and I think those kids are underserved just by that definition. They're in public schools. They often don't have a lot of services, or they have inappropriate services. So the issue about the joint attention, joint engagement play, that's kind of an early childhood notion. But the same issues continue throughout school. So once kids move into elementary school, even if they've done great in early intervention, now they get to elementary school and they don't know how to share and engage with their peers. So you move from therapist or mother, father to peers. And kids in schools who are not very socially engaged really suffer academically, and they suffer in terms of their own mental health. So I think that we should think about engagement as a goal for high-functioning kids that are in regular classrooms as well. The solution is often to put a one-on-one assistant on a child, and that assistant may or may not be well-trained. But when you think about just the incredible skill it takes to do interventions with kids with autism, and then we put somebody with very limited training and we treat them as if they're the expert, it really puts them in a really terrible position, I think, in terms of making decisions for that child's social, emotional, and academic well-being. So we did do a study recently where we saw 60 first through fifth graders. They all had to have an IQ above 65 and fully included in a general education classroom. And we randomized them in the public schools in LAUSD. They were very gracious to let us come in and to do an intervention. We did 12 sessions over 6 weeks with a 3-month follow-up. And the randomized controlled trial part was kids would either get randomized, so we do all the assessments of all of our 60 target children with ASD, and then the child might get randomized to the peer condition, which meant we didn't ever do anything with the child with autism, but we only dealt with the 3 typical peers in their classroom. Those peers had to be nominated as being good peer models. And we did an intervention with them. Or the child might have gotten randomized to a target child intervention, in which case we put a graduate student on that child to intervene on social skills. And it wasn't just any social skills. So we watched them on the playground. We got a lot of information. We tried to make it developmentally appropriate. 12 sessions, 6 weeks, you know that you're only going to hit 1 or 2 targets. So if the child doesn't know how to play the games on the playground, which is actually very common, then we would teach the child how to play the games. That would be an intervention. Or if the child always disrupted everybody else's game, we worked on that, all right? So the third condition was that you could get the peer and the child. But because we couldn't identify a single one of these children, and because of confidentiality, they never came together. So we did a graduate student on the target child, graduate students on the typical peers. Or they just got inclusion. So some of the kids also had one-on-one aids because inclusion comes along with one-on-one aids. So about half the kids had one-on-one aids, and we let it vary because there were so many things to try to control, we couldn't control everything. And besides, they could have an aid one time and then not another, and so too many things. So it was a 2x2 design, so you had a child-assisted approach and a peer-mediated approach. So you could take those 4 conditions and you could really split them into 2. Either you have child-assisted or peer-mediated. Our main outcome measure was a social network map. So what we were interested in, are these kids connected with other kids in the classroom? So we would ask the kids themselves, right? We're not asking parents, we're not asking teachers. We ask the kids themselves, who hangs out with whom in your classroom? And the kids all all privately wrote down who played with whom on the playground. And it didn't matter what an individual kid said because we had to get all of the surveys, put them into a formula to get this little map to pop out. We could show this map to the teachers and they'd say, yep, that's it. So you can see down here we have isolated children, neither of whom are children with autism. And the child in red is a child with autism. So he's connected to another child. And this is a typical pattern. So our kids are not more isolated than other kids, but they tend to be more peripheral. So they tend to have very few friends, and they tend to kind of hang on to groups. But there are kids that are more included. We even had popular kids. So you see the whole range, and we've now done these maps in so many different classrooms. We've had thousands of kids in classrooms talk about who plays with whom. And so we know pretty much that our kids aren't really that isolated in elementary school. That doesn't mean that they don't need intervention. And in fact, I think the 2 children down there in blue who don't have autism probably need intervention. So that was our main outcome measure. And what we found was, I don't know if you would have guessed this, but peer-mediated interventions were the most effective for changing the social networks of kids or how kids are connected to each other. Social connections increased if you had any peer mediation. Children in the class nominated the child with ASD more often as a friend. So the peers that were selected nominated the child with autism, but so did other kids in the class more. And our kids with autism actually didn't nominate other kids more. So there's, I think a point of intervention is helping them realize who could be potential friends for them. We found less isolation on the playground. So I had spy students who would go in. All they had was a picture of a kid. They didn't even know which condition they were in. They'd have to find that kid on the playground. Let me tell you, that is not easy, especially in LAUSD when kids are maybe all one ethnicity and wear uniforms. So and because our kids are very good at isolating themselves. So we'd have to look under stairs and in rooms, and sometimes it's hard to find kids. So But we did find less isolation on the playground. We were hoping we'd find more joint engagement, but that really was just marginally significant. So this treatment, because it was done off of the playground, didn't have as big of an effect as if it had been done on the playground. And I think that's a future direction. And also teachers who were not involved in the treatment and sometimes didn't even know which condition the kids were randomized to reported higher social skills for kids that were in the peer-mediated intervention, which is amazing to me. So all good. So some other findings, though, I think just to think about was one of the questions we asked was, what about children who are doing well? So the child who's popular, who's got a reciprocal friendship, we had about 20% of the kids were like those kids. What happens to them? So these kids had social network status, but they weren't any more engaged on the playground. So I think that's interesting. So again, if you're thinking about a playground intervention, what might help? Well, it might help to connect those two kids in the class before they go out to the playground. Because I don't know if you guys have been on playgrounds anytime recently, but they are crazy places. Kids are running all over the place. If you had one friend, and you might not be able to find him, right? Or you might get distracted. So I think there are some strategies for connecting kids so that they can go out with their friends and be with them on the playground. So playground's a difficult environment. And it requires a specific intervention, one in which one of my graduate students just completed, and that's a whole nother story. But we tried to actually do an intervention on playgrounds, and I think it's the way to go, but we still need to refine that a bit. And then an interesting finding from the study, too, was that the kids who had the one-on-one assistant as the solution tended to have slightly lower IQs, but not by much, and those kids were less engaged. They were less engaged with the adult, the aide, on the playground, and they were less engaged with their peers. So I don't know how to interpret that exactly, except that either the adult wasn't successful at helping the children engage on the playground, or it just isn't the right solution. So I think as we're all trying to get one-on-one aids for kids, we have to kind of think that through, and probably think through the training a bit. Early interventions that focus on core developmental skills in young children really do pay off in later development. So I hope I've convinced you that we need to target these early developmental skills that are deficient in our kids, and that they do pay off in terms of developmental outcomes later. But children continue to need these kind of focused interventions. So we can't so while I did a 6-week intervention and yay, it works, when the kids are 9, it's not as if the kids don't need intervention anymore, and that we need to focus these interventions and think about them as kids change in their own developmental trajectories. And there's a lot of different interventions that could be effective with kids, really reflecting the heterogeneity of the disorder. And then next steps are to deploy interventions into the community that take into account these different findings. And that's something we're trying to do now. We're actually going to partner with Los Angeles Unified and try to actually bring evidence-based practices that make sense to them. And then we're going to try to measure the implementation and the sustainability of those interventions. Because, things have to get better for kids in the environments where they spend the most time.
Connie, that was a fantastic talk. It's so exciting to see the way that you're thinking about assessing real change, in authentic, kind of meaningful behaviors that don't have to just be captured in one setting or with a standardized assessment, but can be really fluid and natural from interactions with whomever. So that's
hard.
But hard, right.
Hard.
And that really target, again, like you're talking about, this core change, in overall development. So I really take my hat off to you for thinking in that way. And also, I imagine to the hope that you're providing to families with older children that, have yet to at least develop more regular verbal skills. So I think that's incredibly important. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but after all that, she's going to say, but.
No, but.
Let me ask
What I wanted to understand a little bit better was the study with Jaspers and the alternative communicative device, and the way in which therapists are using language in that, because I saw, just from my naive eye, I saw some differences in how those three therapists from those three clips you showed differed in how they spoke and when they spoke.
Yep.
And when it overlapped with the device or not.
Yeah.
Could you touch on that?
Well, so there were 2 clips of the therapists with the minimally verbal kids. So, yeah, there are rules about in this EMT, right? And we're trying to do it at Fidelity. So there are rules about when you speak and how often you speak, and you can't speak very often, but it's about once or twice a minute, something like that. And then the device is interesting. So, we didn't have any knowledge about would kids just use the device and then maybe say the word. Some of our kids are saying the word and then using the device. So we're just modeling. We're giving input with the device and we're not expecting output. So that's a little bit different from, say, PRT, where you're asking a lot of questions. So questions are no-no in this particular treatment. So that's interesting too, right? Because a lot of PRT or other kinds of approaches ask kids a lot of questions. And I think that that's okay for some kids. For our kids, they are so treatment response dependent that you ask them a question, like on a test, it's so clear. They know they're supposed to point at something, so they're not looking and they're just pointing at something. They want to get out of it and do the next thing, right? So, just getting them to respond is not, the goal here.
Thank you very much. The videos were very well done, somewhat painful to watch because it takes you back if you're a parent. As minimally verbal, very young children, the engagement techniques are becoming better vetted. They become focused, obsessed on certain things, and the techniques to get them out, to engage them outside of those interests are better. ABA isn't considered child abuse anymore, which it was in the 90s when we began it. But as young adults, because they are so smart and they become so focused and they outpace their peers, what then becomes the motivation to draw them outside of that focus so that they do become more socially engaged? Because as a 3-year-old, you can get them off of the trains or the cars, but as a 15, 20-year-old, how do you get them outside of their computers, animation?
Yeah, so that sort of object focus or kind of obsessive focus. Yeah, I think that there are really good people here that are working on some of those issues with young adults. I think Marjorie, wherever you are, or somewhere here, are working on some of those kinds of issues and the obsessions. So all teenagers and probably young adults do have these different obsessions, but typical. But they can move off of those because they have a variety of interests. They have more than just one interest, and so probably trying to develop that is important. I think because kids spend, where do they spend all of their time? They spend it in school. We need to infiltrate some kinds of evidence-based practices in schools.
So, as usual, a great presentation. Thanks very much. So I guess one of my questions is really kind of a detailed question, and it's really about the parent-mediated intervention. Because one of the nice things about a parent-mediated intervention is that you can have a high-dose intervention in theory. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you encourage parents to use the strategies and help them figure out how to use those strategies at home. Because I think that's probably really critical.
Yeah. So with parent-mediated, usually, could be a long answer. You want to teach them strategies to engage their kid. So you want to engage your kid. You want to have a conversation with it. You want to communicate. So you can use that across everything you do in the daytime. And we talk about that, and we encourage them to think about that. In my under-resourced project, we thought about going across daily routines. And I did this with Amy Weatherby and some other people across the country. And Amy's really big into daily routines. Now, rural Florida is different from LA. And so I think what will be interesting from the study is to think about what are your daily routines. And so I think that's going to be different in and of itself. But you want to basically bring your child along with you as much as you can. And so teaching them those kinds of strategies that they can use across daily routines makes sense. In terms of getting a dose throughout the day, I think we could pretty much tell who was comfortable, confident, who could do it, And you have to practice these things to be able to do them. And so you can kind of tell that. My first study, I had parents do a diary where I said, go home on the weekend and just write down any time you see something happening. I got so many examples, and most of them were not joint attention. So I learned from that experience that the next time, every week when they'd come in for the first session, we would just do a little interview with them. We'd have them do it right there. And so some of the questions are things like, well, have you noticed any changes? Has anyone outside the family noticed changes? Those kind of things. That would be more for buy-in, but it's also just to try to get that conversation going about how these strategies are working for them.
In your introduction, you talked about the importance of positive affect or increases in positive affect in joint engagement, and I'm just curious to hear what you saw in terms of increases in affect, in terms of social motivation to continue.
Yeah, so I think this intervention does affect social motivation. I think the kids, you can see it in lots of different ways. So kids facing the therapist and wanting to play, taking turns, showing more positive affect. But positive affect is a hard one to measure. And also some kids are just, like I have a kid now that the mom keeps saying, the world's passing him by. He's just not enjoying anything. He doesn't find pleasure in anything. And I see her point. He's a very serious little guy. And it doesn't seem like he's ever having fun. And so, we almost get to the point where we're saying, play, then break. Like play is work, right? But play is supposed to be fun. And sometimes trying to find that thing that brings them pleasure that's our job, right? To try to figure out the social motivation and then to link those things together and to give people ideas about how to, increase that. It's hard.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.